British police charged Russell Brand today with rape and sexual assault following an 18-month investigation sparked when 4 women alleged they had been assaulted by the controversial comedian. London's Metropolitan Police Force said Brand faces 1 count of rape, indecent assault, oral rape, and 2 counts of sexual assault. The alleged offenses took place between 1999 and 2005. The accusers have not been identified. Brand has denied the allegations, saying that his relationships were, quote, always consensual. So let's take a legal deep dive into this case. Attorney Hector Diaz joins me once again. Obviously, Hector, serious allegations. And I was wondering, in cases like this, where the victim alleges a rape and sexual assault, the suspect says it was consensual. How hard is that to prove for both sides?
It's okay. So let's just take the prosecutor's side, right? They're the ones that have the burden of proof. They got to establish it. If they're charging Mr. Brand in court in the UK, they feel pretty comfortable, right? When you have a situation where it's he said, she said, right, and that's all you have,
right?
That's difficult. That is really difficult because then you have issues of, was there alcohol involved? Was there some other, ulterior motive for making the allegation? Was there an attempt at a civil settlement early on? So these are all things that a prosecutor balances and looks at. Where it becomes a little clearer is they'll look at, is there an electronic evidence, right? Are there any messages?
Text messages or emails or anything like that?
Any kinds of communication, emails, whatever it may be, right? To see and establish the lack of consent. So oftentimes what you'll see is investigators will do what's called a surreptitious phone call, like a secret phone call, where the accuser will be on the phone calling the person saying, you know what you did, you knew you didn't have consent and you went ahead and did it. And what they're doing is they're listening, hoping that the person will say, I'm really sorry, I didn't know what I was doing. So there are things that, it's so early, he was just charged. So this case is going to, unravel and develop. I was a little surprised that he came out of the gate on X and was just, really just saying, hey, I'm absolutely innocent. I understand why.
Right.
But yeah.
Okay, so you mentioned that. Let's show our viewers here his response to X. Here's part of what he said.
Told you guys that when I was young and single, before I had my wife and family, who were just out of shot over there, my beautiful children, I was a fool, man. I was a fool before I lived in the light of the Lord. I was a drug addict, a sex addict, and an imbecile. But what I never was a rapist. I've never engaged in non-consensual activity. I pray that you can see that by looking in my eyes.
Okay, so again, always surprising when, especially on a day that those, allegations come out, he goes immediately to X, says that. I mean, when they go on in public, defending themselves to everyone, all their fans, what have you, does that help or hurt their case?
I've gotten that text message when, I have a client that is doing that and is, just felt compelled. I'm going to tell my story on, Instagram Live, and I cringe. I do cringe. And I'm sure his PR team is cringing, and, the prosecutors there in the UK and some of these investigators are like, you're admitting to being a fool. The allegation is you're still a fool, and you still are doing this, and you are admitting to engaging and using, illicit substances and alcohol. And how do we know that what your memory was like being on these illicit substances and alcohol? Maybe there are all sorts of things that he's opened the door. So hopefully his team now has surrounded him and said, okay, we get it.
Little damage control.
Get this off your chest. You're going to move forward now, and we're going to defend the case.
Okay, let's get to another big national case here. Luigi Mangione, the suspected shooter of United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson, is now facing the possibility of the death penalty in the murder case against him. Attorney General Pam Bondi directed federal prosecutors this week to seek the death penalty for Mangione, making it the first time the Justice Department will pursue the death penalty since President Trump returned to office for a second term, vowing to resume federal executions after they were halted under the Biden administration. That decision to make the case against Mangione now a capital case comes 3 months after former President Biden commuted the sentences of 37 convicts on federal death row, sparing the lives of all except 3 federal inmates facing execution. Capital punishment has been effectively abolished in New York State, so that means if Luigi Mangione were convicted of state charges, he would face life in prison. All right, so Hector, there's a couple of things going on here. There's state charges, there's federal charges. But why is seeking the death penalty on a federal level so serious?
I think it's just, we were talking a little bit about this, the rarity of how often you see the death penalty in a federal case.
Mm-hmm.
Often that is taken off the table, and there's maybe a plea, or where it's just not charged,
right?
You do see it on the state level. So I think that's just, he is
But
eligible.
why is it so rare that, on a federal level?
I think that there's been a recognition that the sentiment in terms of the death penalty is changing. I think that there's been a lot of research done here in terms of the deterrence factor, some of these issues, and I think those have played into the role of seeking the death penalty with the various attorney generals that have been in office. And so here, though, his defense attorneys are claiming this is politically driven, under the Trump administration, and that it's not appropriate. And so we'll have to see. But for now, it stands.
Yeah. Okay. So prosecutors, they've said that the two cases, again, state and federal, will proceed on what's called parallel tracks, with the state charges expected to go first to trial, and then the federal capital case. Explain, how this goes, because it's not often that we have these parallel tracks, right?
It is interesting. It's interesting, and they're saying that it's going to go this way on paper, but we'll see actually how it plays out in reality. Because on the state, let's say he goes to trial. From what we know of the evidence, and again, what we think we know is very different than what actually is happening behind the scenes in terms of their review. But if in fact he is convicted, he goes to trial. He's going to get life in prison without any possibility of parole.
Under the state.
Under the state. What could happen is his lawyers, and they're probably doing this now, is that there's some conversation between the state, the state of New York, and also the U.S. Attorney's Office and the Southern District of New York, just saying, can we globally resolve this? How do we resolve this? And I think, the defense is probably waiting for the right opportunity to present this if it hasn't already been done, in terms of saying, he will spend the rest of his life in prison. He'll plead to both offenses, state and federal.
Okay.
But he will never see the light of day.
To avoid the death penalty on the federal level.
Right. But it's just there's probably so much work that goes into making that compelling argument, and it's the right moment, the right time, the right pressure point, and and it's going to be based on that defense attorney's review of the evidence and going to the government and saying, there's some issue here. There's some reason why, or maybe there's some mental health issue here that they're gonna develop.
Anything to avoid that.
Right.
All right, Hector, you've been great. Thank you so much for your time on Lori Vallow, plus Luigi, as well as Russell Brand. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
All right, now let's go to meteorologist Crystal Long with our forecast. Crystal.